Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll wait a few moments while the room populates. Okay. First of all, welcome to the eRenew webinar series on Europe and the world. My name is Carrie Otterburn. I am with the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and today I will be your host and moderator. We are joined today by Professor Hanspeter Kriesi, who will discuss his new book on the coming to terms with the European Refugee Crisis. This was recently published. And Hanspeter Kriesi is a professor at the European University Institute in Florence, where he previously held the Stein-Roken Chair. And he has previously taught at the universities of Amsterdam, Geneva, and Zurich. And his research interests include studies of direct democracy, social movements, political parties, interest groups, public opinion, the public sphere, and political communication. Also joining us today as expert discussant is Professor Dr. Robert Kisek. Robert is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Institut Barcelona de Estudis Internacionals, where he is Head of Studies and Coordinator of the International Law of Global Security, Peace, and Development Program and co-coordinator of the Mundus MAP program. His research focuses on the intersection of the foreign policy of the European Union and international organization, specifically on the EU as an actor in the multilateral system, including the ILO, the FAO, the UN General Assembly and Security Council, the WTO, and the IMF. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Hanspeter of approximately 30 minutes, and then we will turn over to Robert to kick off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions. And Hanspeter will, of course, have the opportunity to respond to those before we turn to questions from you, the audience. So feel free to send questions for the speakers at any point during the webinar. You can just use that Q&A function of the Zoom webinar window. You should be able to find that at the bottom or maybe the top of your Zoom window. If you use that, you can send your questions and I will collect those to share with the speakers during the audience Q&A at the end of the session. Before we begin, I'll just share a few quick words about the eRenew project. The EU Research and Education Network on Europe and the World, or eRenew, as we call it, is an Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And the goal of this network is to improve knowledge and enhance debates on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of eRenew, I would like to thank Hanspeter and Robert for joining us today. And it is now my great pleasure to pass the floor over to Hanspeter. You have the floor.
So, thanks a lot for the introduction. I, as you said, will present our book on the European Refugee Crisis, and it's the European Refugee Crisis 2015-16. In the meantime, we had other refugee crises, but our book is focused on 15-16. You see here my co-authors, Argyrios Altiparmakis, Ábel Bojár, and Ioana-Elena Oană. We are 10 years later, and The Economist recently reflected on the most important actor in that crisis, who was Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. And the commentator wrote, "The providential folly of Angela Merkel's migration policy, wir schaffen das," which means we shall make it, has proved a Pyrrhic victory. And he said that now it looks as though Mrs. Merkel spent her political capital on a gamble with high costs. And he ends his comments with a question: does that make it a blunder? And so he says, perhaps, but a generous and humane one. And I agree, Merkel was really generous and humane, but maybe the Economist's commentator underestimates to some extent how she was trapped by the crisis situation in September 2015. She did not really make a fully independent choice. So our study was motivated by these two puzzles. Why were key decision makers like the German chancellor trapped in a desperate situation at the peak of the crisis? And why did they prove unable to reform the common European asylum system? So what did we study? We studied policymaking in the EU and its member states during the crisis. How were decisions taken? Who did take the decisions? And what kind of consequences had these decisions in the policy domain, in the party system, and in public opinion? How did we approach our topic? Our study was part of the so-called SOLID and an ERC synergy project, which studied several crises. And one of these crises was the refugee crisis, which was studied by our team at the EY. Our approach was inspired by the polity approach of the study of European integration, which is rooted in the state-building tradition of Stein Rocken, Stefano Bartolini, and others, and which is described in a JEP article by the 3 PIs of this project. And our approach in this study focuses on the crisis situation and the dynamics it unleashes. How did we do it? Our workhorse was what we call policy process analysis. So we study policy episodes at the EU level, 6 at the EU level and 40 in 8 member states. So 5 times 8 is 40. We had episodes in frontline states, Greece and Italy, in transit states, Hungary and Austria, open destination states, Germany and Sweden, and closed destination states, France and the UK. We did not study the so-called bystander states like Poland or Portugal, which were not concerned at all, which maybe was a mistake, but we already had enough to do with the countries we selected. So based on international and national press coverage, we selected articles in Factiva using appropriate keywords and hand-coding the articles. We hand-coded about more than 1,000 at the EU level and more than 6,000 at the member state level. You can imagine that was quite a task. It was very resource intensive. And you might say, in the meantime, artificial intelligence will solve the problem. We have tried to some extent, but not succeeded, I must admit. What we coded is the type of action, the type of actors, their issue-specific positions, their targets, time, and location. So very few characteristics. In addition, we also did surveys to get the public opinion. We did analysis of election campaigns for the parties, and we analyzed the speeches of radical right actors to find out how they framed the situation. We present our results in 3 parts. The book has 3 parts: on actors and conflict structures, on dynamics of policymaking, and on outcomes with respect to policy, public opinion, and electoral consequences. We have 2 sets of explanatory factors. The first one refers to the institutional context in asylum policy, which is characterized by shared competencies between the European Union and the member states, which results in a lack of harmonization of minimum standards and deficient capacity of some national asylum systems. And although the competence is shared, the final shots are called by the member states. So the common European asylum system rests on what has been called an organized hypocrisy. The second set of explanatory factors refers to the problem pressure and to the political pressure in the crisis situation. And most importantly, this pressure was asymmetrically distributed across the 4 or 5 types of member states, which made it very difficult to come to consensual solutions. Some were just not concerned. Here you see 2 indicators for the policy heritage in the member states. The first indicator is the rejection rate of asylum seekers before the crisis. And the second indicator is the annual budget of the national asylum systems during the crisis. And you see that both types of indicators vary a lot from country to country. So the rejection rate in Sweden was 0.18 or 18%, while it was 92% in Greece or 75% in Hungary. And the annual budget was 3 billion in Sweden and only 300,000 in Hungary. So Hungary didn't have any capacity to deal with the problem, and neither did Greece. You see, Greece had just 10 million annual budget at its disposal. Here you see the differences between the 8 countries with respect to problem pressure, which we measure by monthly submissions of asylum requests as a percentage of the population. And you can see that the transit states, Hungary and Austria, and the open destination states, Germany and Sweden, at the peak of the crisis in fall 2015, which is indicated by the line, the vertical line, you see that they had really enormous problem pressure, whereas France and the UK, the close destination states, didn't have any pressure at all. And also the pressure was very limited in Italy. And in Greece, at the peak of the crisis, it was limited too, because Greece waved through all the asylum seekers. Later on, when it could no longer do that, you see the pressure increased also in Greece. What do we expect as a response to the crisis situation in the EU and its member states in fall 2015? The EU had limited competence, so the crisis resolution highly depended on decision-making in intergovernmental fora, and the member states had a very big say in how the crisis was to be resolved. In addition, the uneven distribution of policy capacities and pressures led to a highly politicized mixture of conflicts, both at the supra and transnational level and the national level, which resulted in a minimum common denominator solutions in line with the failing forward literature and the post-functionalist constraining these senses. Now, this is what we expected. The results in 3 steps. First, the complex configuration of interests at the EU level. First of all, there were the EU authorities who tried to find a common solution. Then there were national coalitions, in particular what we call the sovereignty coalition, made up of the Visegrad 4 countries, Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, who opposed any burden sharing with other member states. Then there were the frontline and open destination states who, of course, tried to share the burden. Fourth, there were the frontline states alone who really wanted to reform the common European asylum system because they were responsible for the accommodation of the refugees according to the Dublin Convention, which they wanted to change. And then there was the humanitarian coalition made up of NGOs and UNHCR, who defended the rights of the refugees. At the first phase, at the peak phase of the crisis, we did, as a result of a multidimensional scaling of our quantitative data, we did arrive at the tripolar configuration of conflicts. On the one hand, you had the European Union and its actors, which were opposed by the coalition of the humanitarians, the supranational UNHCR and NGOs, and on the other hand, by those who didn't want to share the burdens, the bystanders, the close destination states and the transit states, and caught in the middle were the open destination and frontline states. In the second phase of the crisis, the frontline states, the close destination states and the open destination states joined the European authorities, and together they wanted to find a solution. But they were still opposed by the humanitarian actors and by those who didn't want to share any burdens at all. At the national level, national governments were caught in a two-level game with four types of conflicts. First, there was international pressure by EU authorities and other member states, especially on the frontline states. Everybody asks them to follow the Dublin Convention and not to wave through all the refugees. Then there was partisan conflict. The mainstream opposition parties were the most important adversaries of all the governments in the 8 countries. Then there were societal conflicts. They were all opposed by the humanitarian coalition. And then there were intra-governmental conflicts, especially in Germany, where Angela Merkel's own party refused to follow her open doors policy, and she had a very hard time to impose herself in Germany. Now, the second part of our results concerning the dynamics of politicization. We use the indicator of politicization, which is a combination of the salience of the crisis and the polarization of the actors during the crisis. And we did have 3 periods: the pre-crisis period, and then the phase 1, the peak period, and the phase 2, which lasts from April 2016 to the end of 2020. And I show you now the development of politicization at the 2 levels of the EU and of the member states. For the member states, you see the politicization in an average member state. What you see immediately there, the first vertical line refers to the September 2015, and the second vertical line refers to the March 2016 moment. What you see is that politicization increases enormously at the EU level until April 2016, and then it collapses and never reaches that level again. It also collapses in the member states, but relatively speaking, much less than at the EU level. Now, what happened at the EU level? There was September 4, 2015, when a track of refugees moved from Budapest toward the Austrian border. And the Orban government even put buses at the disposal of the refugees and bussed them to the Austrian border. And in that situation, the German chancellor got a phone call from the Austrian chancellor, Faymann, who said, please, please help me. And the German chancellor consulted his coalition partners and could not do otherwise than help Faymann, that is, open the door to this track of refugees who came eventually to Germany. And there is a ZDF documentary which I can recommend. It is really the day, September 4th, in the life of Angela Merkel, and shows very clearly what happened. Now, the plan A of Merkel was a relocation of refugees, burden sharing. And on September 14, the European Council, the Council of Ministers, adopted a plan to relocate 120,000 refugees under German pressure and against very strong opposition from the Visegrad 4. It proved to be a dead end because the Visegrad 4 didn't play ball. And in the first place, it was only about 120,000 refugees, while the problem involved about 2 million. So Germany and Merkel, they pursued, together with the European authorities, Plan B, which was the EU-Turkey agreement. No longer burden sharing, but externalization of the problem. And between October 2015 and March 2016, the EU negotiated with Turkey, and finally, under also the pressure of the closure of the West Balkan route, which was an alternative plan pursued by the Austrians under the guidance of Sebastian Kurz, at the time foreign minister, who cooperated with the Balkan countries and Hungary to find an alternative solution. So at that time, the EU-Turkey agreement was adopted, and as a result, the inflow stopped more or less immediately. Now, at the national level, what we see is border closures and the retrenchment of asylum rules. Border closures concern external borders. For example, the frontline states, Italy did a lot of port closures. Greece in 2020 finally closed its borders, its land border with Turkey. And the transit states like Austria and especially Hungary did already fence building in 2015. There were also internal border closures. They were temporary but renewed several times. For example, the closed destination state like France closed the border to Italy in Ventimiglia, or Austria closed the border to Italy in Brenner. There were a lot of retrenchment of asylum rules, starting with Sweden. Sweden had permanent protection for asylum seekers. Under the pressure, it introduced temporary protection of asylum seekers. Germany tried to facilitate deportations. It tried to render family reunification more difficult. Other countries did that too. And in Austria and Sweden, for example, internal distribution posed the same problem as at the transnational level between the member states. We had the idea that the problem pressure determines politicization all the way, but we found out that this is not exactly what happened, because there were factors endogenous to politics which became increasingly important as the crisis progressed. There were political entrepreneurs, especially in Germany, Seehofer, in Italy, Salvini, or in Hungary, of course, the Orban government, which designed to create a crisis situation where there was none anymore. So they kept up the pressure for their own political purposes. And then there were triggering events such as terrorist attacks, most importantly in Germany and France, which created renewed pressure. There were legislative cycles reflected in strategies of changing governments. And there were the endogenous dynamics of policy responses once set in motion. Once you had temporary border closures, you had to renew them all the time. A special aspect of the dynamics of policymaking concerns the cross-level episodes in the multi-level polity of the EU. Around half of the episodes involved actors from the national and the EU level at the same time, and these episodes were particularly highly politicized. And they came in two versions. In the top-down intervention version, which was a result of non-compliance or lack of compliant implementation of EU policy by member states. For example, the Greeks just dragged their feet and did not install the hotspots the EU wanted them to install. So the EU intervened and forced them to. There were bottom-up interventions triggered by member states taking action to substitute for lack of EU policy. For example, Italy introduced the Mare Nostrum frontier police in the Mediterranean, which then later on it tried to upload to the European level. And there were, of course, these transnational episodes, which I already mentioned, which were triggered by unilateral member action or inaction, for example, not preventing secondary movements. Now, the third part, the outcome of the crisis. We see continuity rather than change. Even if the crisis was a very important one, there was failing forward in the direction of what we already saw before, defensive integration, as Frank Schimmelpfennig calls it, a combination of reinforcing external and internal borders. At the EU level, there was externalization and a reinforcement of Frontex, the external border control. At the national level, there was a reintroduction of border controls, as I already said, and a further retrenchment of asylum policy. So the result in policy terms was consistent with an approach that can be traced back for more than 2 decades. And it was also consistent, I think, with public opinion, which supported what was going on, and transnational conflict configurations, which prevented anything else. The policy outcome did nothing to resolve the underlying conflicts at the EU and the member state level. It sowed the seeds for deepening transnational conflicts, such as the conflict with the Visegrad Four, which reappeared in the so-called rule of law and in the COVID-19 crisis. And it left the EU vulnerable to the weaponization of asylum policy by third countries, by Turkey, which tried in spring 2020, by Morocco in May 2021, and Belarus in summer 2021. There was no wholesale transformation of party systems in any country, contrary to the Eurozone crisis, which led to the transformation of Southern European party systems. This crisis allowed for much room for strategic choices by parties, and it was, of course, a golden opportunity for the radical right. But the radical right did not win all the way. In actually 4 of our countries, Hungary, Austria, UK, and Greece, it was the national conservative parties which outcompeted the radical right and took its place. And in the other 4 countries, it is true, the radical right increased its vote share at the expense of the mainstream right. So in general, what the crisis did, it exacerbated the conflict between nationalists and cosmopolitans in member states. That is, it enhanced what we have called the new cultural cleavage with potentially explosive consequences. Now, how to go further? My last slide. In fall 2020, the previous Commission proposed a pact on migration and asylum, which was adopted in spring 2024, just before the last European elections, and which is set to take effect in June 2026. People have high expectations, but this pact provides hardly any innovation, and it keeps in particular the core principles of Dublin in place. What is also going on is a further toughening of immigration law in the member states. For example, in France in December 2023, with the support of Le Pen, and Le Pen called victory when this law was revised. There is one positive element in the very big refugee crisis, the Ukraine refugee crisis, which came in spring 2022. The European Union implemented the Temporary Protection Directive for Ukrainian refugees. And this directive had been around since the early 2000s. It could have been adopted also for the 2015-16 crisis, but it hasn't. Compared to the inflow from Ukraine, the 15-16 inflow was rather limited. And still, the EU adopted this directive, which allowed refugees to have much more rights in Europe than the Syrian and Afghans, which made the bulk of the 15-16 refugees. But overall, and this is my last word for introduction, no solution is in sight. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hanspeter, for this very enlightening presentation of your book. I think you took the material in a very reasonable amount of time, so thank you for that. And now we'll turn over to Robert to hear from you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me out there. I'd like to begin by obviously giving my thanks to Professor Kriesi, to the staff at the Leuven Center for the Study of Global Governance for the invitation to respond. And I think Hanspeter began very, very sort of poignantly. It is 10 years since the first sight of the Syrian, Afghani, and Iraqi refugees moving through Turkey, trying to get into the European Union, which created this enormous shock to the systems, to the Dublin protocols and so forth, which is what the whole book is about. And I did read a considerable amount of the book. It's 450 pages long, so it's extremely comprehensive in every direction imaginable. And I would like to commend the authors. I mean, it's a fantastic collective analysis on so many levels in order to understand in a level of complexity, something which many, many, many people have looked at. So to be able to go beyond that and make a solid contribution is really something impressive. And I think it's definitely going to become one of, if not the reference text on this going forward. As was mentioned, so I won't repeat that, it was in the earlier slides, the comprehensiveness of the level of analysis of both member states and at the European level. And I think also the way in which it was able to differentiate between states and look at the importance of competencies that was enabling or disenabling the Commission to act. And while it doesn't tell us anything new in the sense of insofar as many other people had found out quite a few of the same sort of conclusions, it goes beyond anything else in terms of the comprehensiveness of explaining the hows and the whys. And that's really where the depth comes in. And also the capacity to understand the synchronicity and dissynchronicity between member states, the same events, the same news stories being understood in different places and what that triggered in different policy cycles. But I'd like to give just 3 reflections, and they have accompanying questions. And so I think the first one obviously begins with something which the authors are fully aware of, which is that they say in the book at the end that they completed the manuscript and sent it to the publishers around 2022. So of course, there's a small part at the end about the impact of the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the migration of people from there into the European Union. And I think more to the point, I want to look at how those intervening years, 23, 24, 25, where we're up to now, really how the book can speak to that, but also to maybe offer the chance to the authors to reflect on going forward. So I looked in preparation for this, I looked at the Eurobarometer 550 flash survey, which was June, July 2024. And the question, of course, I was looking at was what the citizens of the European Union see as the major challenges before them. And it was something which I was kind of expecting to see. Irregular migration is joint top with 33% of the respondents across the EU 27 giving it their #1 priority concern. It is genuinely #1, undisputably, in the Czech Republic, Greece, Ireland, France, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Poland, Slovakia, and Cyprus. It's #2 by barely anything in Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Croatia, and Malta. So what should we make of this? That there is no one, or by comparison, so few people coming across the border, and yet it's not at the astronomical, sort of the levels of 70% that it was when these Eurobarometer surveys were done in 2015, 2016, but it's still ranking in terms of everything else going on 1, 2, or 3 in most member states. So in this sense, is it because what you were studying as a crisis is now the new normal? And if that is the case, what does that say? Because the book is very interesting in the way in which the radical right is discussed as being essentially the political actors that saw an opportunity in this. And in one sense, we may have the situation that this is a highly salient issue for European citizens because the radical right has consolidated its position, and their position in national politics is essentially driven by repeatedly reminding people that the importance of irregular migration persists. So is it a trajectory of the parties having established themselves, or could it be the other way around, that the population remain genuinely preoccupied with this, and that underlying preoccupation is what facilitates the continued salience and support for those parties? So that's a chicken and egg thing, which I think is quite interesting to think about. And also, I think the empirical issue here is very interesting. Now, I'm not an expert on the exact numbers of people seeking asylum and the numbers of regular or irregular migrants entering the European Union at the moment, but it seems to me that we have a situation of either wise people, this 33% on average, who are preoccupied with the major challenge being irregular migration. Is it because they are concerned about whatever number of percentage of migration, whatever number of people crossing the border will always be too many? So is it essentially an expectation that borders should be shut? Absolutely. And until that happens, they will never let it lie. Or conversely, is it perhaps a legacy issue, which would be to say that although the numbers of new arrivals has gone down, the residual who are integrated or in degrees of being integrated, depending, of course, if you're in the process of seeking asylum, there are often very strict restraints on how much you can work, where you can live, etc. So in this sense, is this concern for irregular migration actually to do with concern for the way in which societies seem to have become more xenophobic or concerned about the degree of wanting to roll back multiculturality? So in that sense, are we looking at a politics of the undeliverable? Two desired outcomes, either closed borders or a mass removal. And we know of one country in the world which is trying to do this. The US has clearly made these two things political goals, which it thinks it can at least chip away significantly at. But I think in that sense, we need to ask ourselves the big question. This is the first point that I'm sort of coming up to. In the book, the left liberal center is clustered together as being the sort of part of the political spectrum which shied away from grasping the issues that were at hand. Whereas the radical right grasped the opportunity, and as Hanspeter showed at the end, in some countries, the mainstream right wrestled it back off them, and sometimes in other 4 countries, the mainstream right were actually vanquished by the new radicals. So in this sense, I want to know what the authors would think about to what point does this concession of this major issue, which seems to be highly salient and remaining so, despite changing empirical realities, at what point do the other parts of the political spectrum have to grasp this, send an alternative message, harden their stances, or should this be something that will over time be seen to go away? So I'm curious to know sort of the what now going forward, because the triggers that were established from the analysis that has been done are now very different, but the salience remains and the interest is up there. So this is my big question for them, the kind of how do we go forward in this new, perhaps normal politics? Second point. Now then, it's going back to the issue of 2022, the remarks that were made about this temporary protection directive that was initiated, passed by council, very short notice, I think 4th of March 2022, so within a week or fortnight of the initial invasion. And I think that the message which came from Hanspeter before, this was a positive to be taken away. And that Europe did better the second time. And of course, one of the things which comes to mind here is, does that mean that it's the type of refugee crisis that matters? What, to unpack that slightly, we might mean is that perhaps the proximity of Ukraine, the sort of threat, the existential nature of it, that was the war of aggression that Russia started, and the way it was presented among European populations, that Ukraine was the sort of the bulwark of protection. Maybe that is one of the explanations. And of course, an analogy to that, something which we should not forget, is that during the 2015-16 window, Venezuela was always also experiencing mass outward migration, 5.5 million people, so it made what Europe experienced look quite small by comparison. A lot of it was shouldered by the neighboring states, so Colombia took a huge amount of people in. And Mercosur and sort of the Andean Pact and Latin America in general did quite a lot more in some respects than Europe did to be able to facilitate the movement of these people. And perhaps there it was also to do with language, it was to do with historical culture, it was to do with sort of salience of the experience of what was going on in Venezuela. So in both cases, it would be to say what type of crisis matters. And if it's understood more clearly by the population, perhaps it makes it easier to accept these massive changes. And the second, which is the elephant in the room here, which is what all of the critical perspectives would say, is that this is something we need to address through the difference of race, ethnicity, and religion. And that the second crisis was very different from the first crisis because the people who were coming were very different. And I'd like to hear more about that, because in the book, that's one of the big areas where I don't find talk about the importance of race, religion, ethnicity, and essentially the potential argument which is given, it's given widely, which is this underlying institutional racism, and xenophobia. And xenophobia is mentioned, I should say, but racism per se, which is driving some of these differentiated outcomes. I think that might be something we need to think about openly. And the third, very briefly, because I know I don't want to take up too much time, near the end of the book, the policy goal is stated, it's page 337, and it says, the goal is to regain control over the flows of refugees and asylum seekers in Europe in a sustainable way. And what was going on simultaneously to the sort of narrative in this book was, of course, the preparations for the Global Compact on Migration, which was being drafted through the UN system, but primarily it was this acknowledgement that states of origin, transit states, and destination states needed to work together and to cooperate in order to really achieve any of their outcomes and their policy goals, because individually it was not possible. So collaboration was necessary. And that speaks to this larger issue that the way to really manage migratory flows is to think about the reasons people leave and have to search out those new opportunities, which are not, of course, always or even that often driven by selfish desires for more money, which is perhaps somehow the economic migration narratives feed it, but it could be driven by poverty, it could be driven by war, it could be driven by famine, it could be driven by climate change. So in that sense, the argument was there are many things which you can do to stabilize the region, which stop the flows in the first place. And of course, this is the sort of final remark, is that the European Union in the last couple of years, in response to Ukraine, in response to the Trump administration and the posturing on the future of NATO, has become much more concerned with restraining or pulling down investment in FDI. It's becoming ODI, overseas development assistance, and much more concerned with militarization, increased military spending, and so forth. So in some respects, all of the work that may have been really working towards reducing flows, that was in the broader sort of wider portfolio of foreign policy, spanning from sort of climate mitigation all the way through to sort of enhanced trade and cooperation and development, that's all going away. So maybe this goal of controlling and managing flows is actually being lost, because some of the mechanisms that would have done it at the macro level have just been sort of whittled away, become less effective, and that perhaps would be the underlying reason why this problem also doesn't go away at the policy level for those who are directly working on migration policy, because at many other levels that could have been important to sort of change the macro picture, that isn't being done anymore. So I'll leave it there. I hope within those comments, some people in the audience find something that they would like to have asked, or else they might want to go further and push on certain issues more. But thank you so much for the invitation. And I do really recommend digging into the book, because it is a fantastic piece of research and academic scholarship.
Thank you very much, Robert. We'll pass immediately over to you, Hanspeter, for your response.
Yeah, I can especially respond to the first 2 points. The third is a bit too much off for me, but you mentioned this survey in July 2024. We also had done a survey in our project, and we also found, we asked what is the most important crisis the EU has lived through, and that was before COVID when we asked, and people, the number one crisis was the refugee crisis. But it was number one in Northwestern Europe. In Southern Europe, the Eurozone crisis was number one. So Northwestern Europe, the open destination states, that was Northwestern Europe. They got to have to deal with the problem. And that's why it was so important in Northwestern Europe. You talk about reciprocal causation, the chicken egg problem. Is it the parties that incite the people to radicalize, or is it the political potential of the people that incites the parties to adapt their message? I think it's both. And I think it is very hard for the left in this situation to find a good response, because the people on the ground are very much in favor of the message that comes from the right. Closing down borders is a majoritarian opinion across Europe. Protecting, take back control, that was Brexit. So in the case of Brexit, the consequences of the refugee flows were very important and contributed to the exit of Great Britain. I mean, the left has tried to accommodate its message to this new situation in some countries. For example, Denmark. The Danish Social Democrats have adopted a message which is very close to the center-right or let's say conservative message about refugees. So, I mean, the potential, the political potential of this issue is very large. And the left has not yet found a convincing position to deal with this. That is what I would say. The second point you mentioned, the Temporary Protection Directive and the Ukraine crisis. I mean, you suggest that race, ethnicity, and religion were different. The refugees that came in this crisis, they were white, they were Christian, and they were from a neighboring country. And I would say gender is also very important. There were women and children mainly, whereas the Syrians and the Afghans were mainly young men. And these women and children from a neighboring country were much more easily received, that's for sure. But I think it was not just that. There were also political considerations. Take, for example, the visa requirements. These Ukrainians could get into the European Union without a special visa for 90 days. So the question, of course, for Europe was, what happens on day 91 when they are all in? We cannot throw them out. I think that was, again, a trap, which in this case led to a learning experience, which incited the responsible leaders to adopt the Temporary Protection Directive. But I would also like to point out, I did a paper with one of my postdocs, Alex Moise, about the comparison of Germany and Hungary in the two refugee crises, 15-16 on the one hand and 22-23 on the other hand. And we found that Hungary did not accept any refugees in both crises. So Hungary just waved them through also in the Ukrainian crisis. So for purely political reasons, the government did not accept refugees in Hungary. By the way, and I think this is also important, these radical right parties did not frame, or I mean, they uniformly frame the crisis experience. They varied enormously. The one thing they shared is the idea that these incoming refugees lead to increasing crime. That is a frame they used in all the countries. But racist or religious arguments were relatively rare. So I mean, they know that this is delicate, so they will not in Europe use this kind of language. In the United States, it's easier for sure. Finally, you say at many other levels, your third point, decisions are taken or the policies develop in a direction which renders a solution to the asylum crisis more difficult. I can only agree with you. And I don't, that's why in the end I'm pessimistic. I say I don't see a solution. As you say, we wrote this 3 years ago and we finished our manuscript in 22. But still, I mean, in the conclusion, I added some words based on what we experienced in the meantime, and this renders me quite pessimistic.
Thank you for that. That's a bit of a sad message, but but it's very insightful and very interesting. Now we have a couple of questions from the audience, so I will go ahead and jump into those. So the first one is about the EU-Turkey agreement that you mentioned previously. And specifically, to what extent did the EU-Turkey agreement and other maybe externalization strategies during the refugee crisis institutionalize new modes of EU crisis governance? And then another question about how the discursive shifts during the refugee crisis it's in a similar way, have they conditioned EU response to subsequent crises, or have they reconfigured public perceptions of EU's legitimacy? And did that impact the response to later crises like the COVID-19 or the Ukraine war? And then a third and final question. It's been 10 years now, as we've mentioned, and the Schengen system has endured, though it was tested. And of course, the book mentions how much this was tested. So this question might go a bit beyond the book, but maybe we can take advantage of your broader research and also the work you were doing with the project that looked at multiple crises. Maybe we can get a bit of a comparative perspective on how the Schengen system was tested, and was it ever really at risk of collapse as a result of this crisis? And is there anything we can take away from the fact that it's still intact, that it's still around? So I think we'll start with those.
Okay, the EU-Turkey agreement. I mean, from the point of view of the European decision makers, it worked. Although the mechanism that is mentioned in the question did not work at all, but the inflow was stopped. And later on in 2020, Erdogan tried to come back and put pressure on the European Union once again to get more money out of it. I mean, the original agreement was mainly an agreement which worked because the EU paid 6 billion euros for Turkey to accommodate refugees. And then in 2020, Erdogan asked for more money and got more money. And at the same time, he sent refugees to the Greek border, which then was protected by the Greek police and von der Leyen and other figureheads. They went to the Greek border to support the Greeks. And then came COVID and the whole thing was forgot. But the weaponization of the refugee flows was not only used by Turkey, but also by Libya, by Morocco, I said so, and by Belarus more recently. Now, the discursive shifts, I did not quite get the question. You're muted.
My apologies. Mainly the question refers to the discursive shifts that resulted from this crisis. Within the EU, did that play a role in conditioning EU's response to subsequent crises?
See, I said what happened is that this crisis shaped a coalition. That's not necessarily discursive. It's a political coalition that formed, which came up later on again. The Visegrad 4 coalition played a big role in COVID-19 crisis because it refused first to ratify the NGEU fund, which was the most important measure to come out of the COVID crisis in terms of economics. And in the end of 2020, especially Hungary, but also Poland, they refused to ratify this fund if they did not get their own money. And because they were threatened to not receive money because of the rule of law crisis, both developed in the direction of illiberal democracies. And the EU at the time wanted to limit, let's say, payments to countries that didn't have real democratic procedures. And then what happened is that Hungary was allowed to ask the European Court of Justice whether this was in order, that the link between payments through the NGEU and democracy conditions. The European Court of Justice said this was in order, and then the European Union stopped money flowing to Hungary. But later on, it closed its eyes again and paid Hungary. And you know how many times Hungary put the European Union under pressure subsequently in the context of the Ukraine war, when Hungary took the position of Russia and so forth. So forbearance was a kind of discursive shift for a while, which then no longer was tolerated. And the Commission said so, and the Council said so. Now Hungary should follow suit, or we don't no longer pay. And 10 years later, I mean, I already talked about this. It's quite sad, but there are no solutions around.
Thank you very much. It's sad to end on this note, but I think that is the key message of the book. So it's very interesting and very insightful, and I really appreciate you sharing your research with us. That is all the time that we have for today. So we'll end here, but I really want to thank both Professor Hanspeter Kriesi and Professor Robert Kisak for joining us today for this very interesting discussion, and really thanks to the audience for joining in with their questions and participation. Before leaving you, I'd just like to announce that the season for our webinar series is now announced on eu-.eu. Our next webinars feature Mariana Tavares on the law and politics of global competition. That's on 9th October. And then we have Amitav Acharya on the once and future world order, and that's on the 13th of October. To sign up for those, that's eu-renew.eu/webinars. So thank you very much again to both of our guests here today for joining us, and thank you very much to the audience, and hope to see you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.